Even if it's a rough course, you'll get a fine grade in
Microjig, maker of the gripper. Work safer, work smarter.
Hey, it's everyone's favorite part of woodworking, sanding. And by everyone, I mean nobody. Sanding and sandpaper is a big subject, big enough that there are actually entire books devoted to the topic. Seriously, think about that if people find your hobbies and interests odd. But I'm gonna limit this video to the most common sanding you'll use in a home workshop. All sandpaper, whether it's a sheet or for a power sander, comes in varying degrees of coarseness. The bigger the number, the smoother or finer the paper. And there's a lot of grades available. Thankfully, you don't need them all for woodworking. I recommend keeping just 3 on hand and in roughly these proportions. 220 and 80 grit combined make up about half my stock, and 120 grit makes up the other half. Technically, 80 grit sandpaper is considered a medium grit, but I consider it coarse in my shop because I don't use anything rougher. It's great for quickly removing sections of wood. This is especially useful if you've, say, joined a couple of boards together that aren't quite flush. 80 grit is aggressive enough that you can use it for shaping and carving. It's also great for rounding over sharp edges. Sometimes the faces of boards may have scratches or dents, which are easy to remove with coarse paper. And 80 grit is useful for stripping paint and other finishes. It might take a bit longer, but the sanding tasks I just mentioned can also be done with 120 grit paper. For some shaping tasks, it's a better choice. Since it's less aggressive, you can maintain better control over the smoothing. It's also a good option if you just need to ease over sharp edges slightly. Unless there are major gouges or dents or uneven spots, 120 is often the only grit of sandpaper I use on my projects once they're assembled. It's the best of both worlds. It evens out rough areas and smooths the wood to a finish-ready surface. Of course, there are exceptions. For instance, after sanding with 120, I will sand wood even smoother with 220 grit paper if I'm going to apply an oil finish, such as tung oil. But if you're going to apply lacquer or polyurethane, I see no need to waste the time sanding the wood any further than 120. The finish itself is what's going to give you its silky smooth feel. And if you're painting a project, you could relax about almost all sanding. Just sand out the dents and unevenness and imperfections, and the paint will do the rest. Keep in mind that most fine grit sandpapers are for finishing and not usually used on bare wood. Sure, you can work your way through all the grits of sandpaper all the way up to 1200 grit if you like, and your project will feel incredibly silky smooth and you'll love it. But you'll want to apply a protective finish to most projects, which will cancel out all that sanding work you did. Again, an exception might be for tung oil or linseed oil, which will soak into the wood. Note that I don't include Danish oil here, which is a polyurethane blend. I use 220 grit sandpaper for sanding between coats of polyurethane finish so that each layer can bond to the next. For lacquer, the finish I use the most, you don't need to sand between coats because each layer fuses to the next. After applying a few coats of lacquer, I lightly sand the surface with 220 paper before applying the final coat. This is really important for removing any drips and especially all those little bumps and dust particles you can feel when you rub your hand over the surface. Light sanding before applying the final coat of any finish is what separates a good finish from a great feeling finish. Also do the same thing for small painted projects, toys and such. Lightly sand the paint before applying a second or final coat and you'll be amazed at how different the surface feels. Here's how to fold a sheet of sandpaper and extend its life by keeping the grit from rubbing against itself. The The least expensive way to sand is to buy sheets of sandpaper and sand by hand. You can wrap the sandpaper around a sanding block, or you can just use your hand as a sanding block. But for most projects, hand sanding will get old really quick. Instead, consider buying a random orbit sander. This is the most useful and versatile sander you can own. Its motion is called random orbit because it doesn't just spin, but moves around in random directions, helping to prevent circular sanding scratches on your work. It uses sandpaper discs that attach with hook and loop or Velcro. These holes are there to suck up a lot of the sanding dust as you're sanding. It either collects into this container or you can attach a vacuum hose. Sanding is a no-brainer. Just flip the switch and move the sander around the surface of your work. A random orbit sander can cover large surfaces such as tabletops pretty quickly. Check your progress with your hand until it feels smooth. Also examine the wood from a low angle to see if there's any imperfections you might have missed. This is a belt sander. It's super aggressive and I don't recommend it for much woodworking. It's very easy to gouge your workpiece and often causes more damage than it's worth. It's best for construction projects or very rough carpentry where you need to remove a lot of material fast, or just for racing. Well, that was pretty fun. That alone might be a good enough reason to buy a belt sander. One way you can use it effectively in a woodworking shop is to mount it upside down and take the workpiece to it. That'll give you a lot more control. I have two benchtop sanders that are relatively inexpensive and very handy to have. First, this combination strip sander, disc sander. If you're interested in getting a benchtop sander, this is the one I recommend. It's my go-to sander for all kinds of tasks. I mostly use the disc for shaping and removing material. It's especially handy for sanding off ridges left by bandsaw cuts and for sanding curved pieces down to exact lines. One of its main benefits is that it has a tilting table. This helps you keep your pieces square while sanding, or you can tilt it to create bevels. When I first bought this sander about 15 years ago, I thought I would probably never have a need for this 1-inch belt sander on the side, but as it turns out, wow, that is very handy to have. You can use the table to help you sand wood, but mostly I tend to sand freehand up here for hard to reach spots and even to carve shapes. And it's really handy for grinding and sharpening tools. One limitation is that you can't sand inside curves with a disc sander. For a hand sanding solution, you could wrap sandpaper around a dowel or a can. Or you can get these various diameter sanding drums that fit into a drill or a drill press. You can also get pretty good results with a random orbit sander if the curve isn't too tight. A number of years ago, a viewer to the show sent me this oscillating spindle sander, which makes sanding inside curves a breeze. It comes with a number of different sizes of spindles that are easy to change out. It has a spinning up and down movement to maximize all the paper and reduce circular scratch patterns in your board. Sanders are some of the safest power tools in the shop, with one exception: the fine sawdust that sanding creates. Aside from the short demos in this video, whenever I'm sanding, I make sure that I have good airflow through my shop and I attach my shop vac to the tool. And I always wear a filter mask. So that just scratches the surface of sanding. There are all kinds of sanders I didn't mention, and even more techniques and uses for sandpaper. What are your favorite sanding tips and tricks? Leave them down in the comments so you can help out others. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to share it and subscribe to Woodworking for Mere Mortals for new videos every week. And if you're just getting started, be sure to check out the rest of my Basics series. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next week.